Welcome to all who are watching this recorded version of the Autumn Lecture Series. Sadly, this has been postponed due to the sad passing of our Queen. However, we are so delighted to be able to record this for you so that you can enjoy this at a later point. But why are we doing these talks? Well, Marble Hill has been revived. We've been able to invest in the landscape, which is what you're going to hear all about now. We've been able to open the house for free 5 days a week, serviced by fantastic volunteers in our property management team. But it's a great opportunity to see the new curatorial work that's been happening within that space. We've got a great cafe, and with every cup of coffee you can have a fantastic sip and also know that you're giving back to the charity. And we've got a new play area, improved sports facilities, and of course these events that are supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund grant that we've been very kindly given. But it's not about the whole project. This is about the fantastic rejuvenation and transformation of the landscape of Marble Hill. And I'm delighted to be joined by two people who've been so instrumental in making that happen. Today we have John Watkins, who is our head of Gardens and Landscapes for English Heritage, and also Emily Parker, who's been the lead historian on the landscape of Marble Hill. So it was with great delight that I get to introduce these fantastic speakers for you this evening, and for you to hear a little bit more about how they revived Marble Hill. John and Emily.
Well, good evening, everybody. And I'm John Watkins, and Emily Parker will be joining you shortly. And it's my pleasure tonight to talk about the journey of reviving the landscape at Marble Hill. And we'll be taking you from the concept to delivery. But just a bit of scene setting. Marble Hill is sat just by the Thames, between Richmond and Twickenham. And the site came to English Heritage in the 1980s following the demise of the GLC. But what is interesting, Marble Hill itself was saved from being built on by public campaign in 1902. So it's amazing that we have this site today with exactly the same boundaries. So that is something that is quite rare. So it was back in September 2004 that we commissioned a report, and we commissioned a green flag standard report. And green flags are the awards that are given to parks that are delivering high quality experience to their visitors. And so we thought this was the best way to get a sort of snapshot of how we were doing. And the report came back that the park was not badly maintained, and the impression the site is maintained primarily as a public park, and secondly as a historic Grade 2 landscape. However, it was failing to really deliver on either. Basically, the school report said we could do better. So from that report, that helped us to get agreement that this was a major site that we needed to invest on and improve on our visitor facilities and visitor experience and the heritage experience and understanding of this really important historic site. Now, if I can just pass you on to Emily Parker, who will now give you an introduction to the history of the site and the person who created it.
Thanks, John. So I'm just going to talk a little bit very quickly about who Henrietta Howard was and a little bit about her landscape and some of the research we did that led into this new restoration project that we're going to talk about today. So this is Henrietta Howard, painting from about 1724, and she was mistress of the Prince of Wales, who would later become George II, and she later became the Countess of Suffolk. But she was also a remarkable woman in her own right. She became an extraordinary figure in court society, and she was really surrounded by this circle of writers, poets, and politicians. she created Marble Hill House, which you can just glimpse through the trees here on this slide, as a place to entertain this kind of elite circle of friends. Marble Hill is, as John said, situated on the bank of the River Thames. And at this time, it was at the string of this very fashionable sort of string of 18th century houses and residences. And the area had become a focus of culture, of inspiration, taste and design. And the landscape is this idea of this new dawning of this new Arcadian Thames on the bank, Arcadian sort of landscape on the bank of the Thames. So Henrietta was surrounded by quite a large group of opinionated figures when it came to garden design. And two of these were Alexander Pope and Charles Bridgeman. So Alexander Pope, the poet, who obviously lived locally and who was Henrietta's friend, and Charles Bridgeman, who would later become the royal gardener. And he was very much a very fashionable garden designer of the period. They met on site in 1724 with Henrietta Howard and discussed the changes they wanted to make to the landscape. They were both at the forefront of the changing ideas of fashions of garden design at this time, and they were inspired by sort of classical literature and gardens of sort of ancient Greece and Rome. The survival of this type of garden is really rare. There's only a handful of these kind of villa landscapes surviving. And so Marble Hill is a very important place where you can see this. And that was something that that Green Flag report said, was that you can't see that heritage in the landscape today or before the project. So the first task was to review all the previous research on garden design for the site. And we also undertook new research to get the best understanding of the site possible. So lots of new evidence came to light as part of that. Some of which was about the role of the Duke of Argyll, who we now understand his role much better in how he was involved at Marble Hill. We understand the idea about Pope and his influence at Marble Hill much better and how much was influenced by him. We also came up with new evidence, direct evidence, that gave us understanding of sort of which shaped our proposal plans, which gave us details about things like planting and more visitor accounts and visitor descriptions of the site, which we could then use when we were putting forward our ideas about full revival. So one of these is this poem, which we found, which hadn't been seen or found in the record before, which is a poem about the grotto from 1764. And it gives us the kind of detail that we're looking for as people who want to restore and conserve landscapes. And it talks about the jasmine and the lilac too, and the myrtle and the laurel green, all those kind of little bits of detail about planting that we can then use to sort of shape our proposals. But a key feature that hadn't really been researched before was this state plan from about 1749. And this showed the garden in the middle of its heyday, after it had been transformed by Henrietta Howard, and it showed her garden as it had been created at that time. This is a sort of detail of the middle of it, and the house is at the top and the Thames is at the bottom. And this is the plan that we studied in detail. It'd been known about, the people had known about it for about 20 years, but no one had really studied it properly in detail before. So it gave us a wealth of information about how the garden was designed, planted and used, and it included key features like the 9-pin alley, which we wouldn't have known about from any other sources. So this was the kind of one of the key documents we used to put that landscape restoration together. But alongside that, we used this new documentary evidence, but we also needed research about what was surviving on the ground. So in order to do that, we commissioned Historic England to do some sort of landscape survey work. So things like geophysics, ground penetrating radar, earthwork survey. So all the things that we needed to understand the fabric of this historic landscape that survived today. And we used this with the research that we'd already done to inform our proposals for the landscape. That's a very brief introduction to some of the kind of historic research that went into this. And John's now going to talk a little bit more about some of the other aspects of the project.
Thank you very much, Emily. And so we'll be coming back to the history in a moment, but let's pass on to the biodiversity. And what this picture shows so well is how the house really connects with the Thames. But it's also interesting to note how, in some ways, how little the structure is actually changed. But focusing on the biodiversity is, if you're needing to understand a landscape, you need to carry out thorough surveys. So in the same way that we've researched the history, we've carried out archaeology, we need to do the same for biodiversity. So in 2018, we carried out a preliminary ecological survey. And this identified that we had 14% broadleaf woodland and 8% semi-improved grassland. We also had a number of additional reports looking at bats, badgers, birds, understanding the range of birds that we had on site, ones that were really important, the ones that we could improve on. Also reports on the trees, the soils and hydrology. So it's really trying to understand the whole ecosystem in there and how it works, what's the value at the moment, and what we can work on to improve. So just from that basis, we realized that what we wanted to do is increase the semi-improved grassland, i.e. the meadows, improve the quality of the woodland, have more woodland margins, more shrub layers, and improve linkages. So that was sort of the start. And and these images here, key. If you look on the top right, that's our black walnut. That's one of our oldest trees on site, possibly planted in Henrietta's time, and that's one of Britain's champion trees. We already had meadows at the start, but we're looking at getting more of them and actually improving the species in them. And I'll be coming to that a little bit later. So next slide, please. But also the infrastructure of the park was important, and I think this was picked up in the Green Flag report. There was the quality of fencing was not good. It was in a bad state of repair. Sports facilities were poor and worn out. Shelters vandalized, and the woodlands were okay for wildlife, but definitely could be better. Because there'd been very little thinning, there were an awful lot of very young trees that were competing out, preventing any good specimens to provide future succession. And one of our aims was to ensure we had good trees for the future and good understory flora that would then provide the, in a way, the pantry for the rest of the ecology. Next slide, please. And this slide, I think, is quite helpful. In this aerial shot, we've got the 1749 plan on the right-hand side and an aerial shot before the project. There you can, on the left-hand side, you can see the house. You can see the woodland quarters, and you can see how actually the woodland quarters had diminished in their extent, particularly towards the south, and we'd lost the avenues. What we look to do is to both get these avenues back and get the diversity of the history, but also improves the diversity of wildlife on site. Could I have the next slide, please? And so we employed landscape architect J&L Gibbons to produce our landscape plan for us. And this involved bringing in a whole range of different consultants. I've mentioned the ecologists before, and archaeologists and hydrologists and engineers and sports pitch specialists to be able to pull this whole master plan for the landscape together. And this is not only the master plan for delivering the project, but it's also, we have a management plan for how we're going to manage the park beyond that, and also its ecology. And all this was put together, and we applied to the National Heritage Lottery Fund for an award. And we were very fortunate in being awarded over 5 million. If I could have the next slide, please. Here's just some of that research going on with the grotto archaeology, and where we're very fortunate that, and it's really interesting, is the archaeology identified features that were found on the 1749 plan. even including planting pits. Some of the planting pits were exactly as they were shown on the plan. And I'll go to the next slide, please. But during sort of the planning and consultancy phase, we shared these proposals with the local authority and with the local community, and there were a number of areas where there were concerns. Particularly, the cafe was thought to be, we first proposed a new build in the cafe, but then that, we amended that and make use of historic buildings. And we extended the present play area, maintaining the existing play area that was still enjoyed by many. And one other interesting feature that people commented on that we hadn't considered until we consulted was the turning circle at the front of the house. Originally, we'd proposed to restore the sort of half moon turning circle that you can see on the top there in the 1749 plan. And in the Victorian period, this was changed to a sort of circular turning circle. When we consulted with people, they said, no, we want you to keep that because there have been generations of children that have learned to ride their bicycles by going round and round that turning circle. So that more contemporary 20th and 21st century history is an important part of the park. So hence we've maintained it. Grab the next slide, please. And then looking at the sort of the central pleasure ground around the house. Our initial proposals were to complete all the landscaping in one go, but it was suggested to us that we should extend our program of delivery sort of beyond the HLF program in order to minimize the impact of existing wildlife and to allow newly planted areas to establish before we restored the final sections. So if you look at the at the right-hand drawing, you'll see both on the east and the west side, Emily's pointing out, two shaded in areas, and those are the non-intervention zones that will be developed next autumn and winter. So that will be autumn and winter 23 and 24. Also, you'll also notice that we've reduced the density of the avenues and the tree planting either side of the avenues. And then that was also a request that we keep more of the east-west views. And I think that's been a good decision. It both gives us tree cover, allows more space for the trees to deliver, for the trees to grow. But also, I think it's those areas with our very hot summers are already shown this summer to be valued by our visitors. Can I have the next slide, please? Sport, hugely important. The football, rugby, and cricket areas needed a lot of work on the surfaces. They were very compacted. They didn't have all the right grasses in them, so they didn't take wear as they should have done. So what we needed to do is we needed to improve the playing surface, get a better drainage in there, and to improve that species mix. So over the length of the project, each year we would work on some areas, and we've now restored all of them, and we're just waiting for the last two pitches for the grass to sort of grow back after having dried up during this last summer, before they are all available for people to play on. Also, it's worth mentioning children's play, which is another key part. We next to the small children's play area near the cafe, we put a small area with more sort of intensive play, but all the way around the site we've also added informal play, and I think this is one way to help parents encourage their children around the park and also get a bit of a good walk in as well. Have the next slide, please. Within the pleasure grounds, here you can see the proposals with the avenues of trees, increased long grass areas, and there we have the Georgian flower garden, that's already established quite well, but you'll see a picture of that a little bit later. Next slide, please. There you can see the plum orchard with another area of meadow. Also we've got the Hornbeam arcade. I'm afraid that picture makes it seem a bit flat. It's much more rounded and elegant than it appears here. And some of these features, actually, like that arcade, will take us a number of years for the Hornbeam to grow up to create that whole experience. The next slide, please. And one area that has taken us quite a while to develop, and in fact this is where COVID came in and delayed our archaeology for the grotto by a whole year, which meant that our analysis then took longer. And so the one area, a bit of the project that has gone beyond our sort of opening has been the grotto. But the grotto we see there was restored in the 1980s, but without the evidence that we have today. And so they could see there had been wing walls, but instead of bringing them out as sort of generous wing walls, they built sort of very tight walls, which made very little use of the space. And so our archaeology showed this to be something quite different. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But what was very, very helpful was realizing the importance of the hermitage at Richmond, which was built for Queen Caroline, who in effect was Henrietta's boss. And there's quite a lot of similarities, although the structure was built above ground here rather than underground. And we were interested to see here the use of the vertical trees, junipers and probably Cupressus sempervirens, and we've used that in the new proposals. Next slide, please. Looking at the biodiversity, here you can see our sort of proposals in extended tree planting, improving shrub planting, shrubberies, and woodland edges. All of these creating networks, communicative networks of different habitats, and both within the park and then linked to outside the park. And all this sort of detail fed into our proposals for the whole site. Next slide, please. And so on the what have we actually done? And here you can see the results here on the left-hand side. Here we have the arcade, and we're starting to train in those arches, as you can see there. On the middle picture, that is the plum orchard, which is in the northeast quarter, and then in the south west quarter, we've got the 9-pin bowling alley, which we found both on the plan and it was also excavated and found by our archaeologists. And 9-pin bowling was very fashionable in the upper classes in the 18th century, and that later became popular for all, and you would often find sort of pubs and things would have 9-pin bowling alleys when they became more widely enjoyed. Could I have the next slide, please? Here on the left, you can see the flower garden, and there's again still establishing, and on the right-hand side, one of our new avenues. And so, and I think the important thing to remember about the park and about planting is, this is the start of something, not the end of something. And so the new planting needs to establish. We are then very much managing a historic ecosystem as well as a native ecosystem. And that is sort of one thing that's quite exciting. Next slide, please. The meadows have been restored, and one of the ways we look to improve biodiversity is to bring in new seed and bring them in from good local meadows, and you can't get much local than Ham. And so this is green hay, so it's just been cut, and then you need to rapidly transport it to the new site. And here you can see the garden team and volunteers spreading the green hay that's got the seed in it, and over time that will improve our biodiversity. But I think a lot of people don't realize that in order to maintain a biodiverse meadow, you do need to cut a meadow, and we are cutting different bits at different times in order to manage the vigor of different things and keep that diversity. We've also put up bird and bat boxes, and this image, I think, on the right-hand side is from the ice house meadow and a campion. So next slide, please. But none of this could have happened without people. And we're very lucky to have Kate Slack, who joined us as head gardener, and Jack, her apprentice, who worked with our amazing volunteers and our amazing range of volunteers who looked after and have really made a wonderful kitchen garden, but have cleared a lot of the woodland areas and planted all the new planting, mulched it and maintained it. And so it's been a real sort of community effort. And again, this is the start of it. So our volunteers will continue to be absolutely critical in maintaining and making the park we want to have. And also audience development. Our wonderful audience development manager, Rachel, has really done a wonderful job in helping us link and communicate with the community. Next slide, please. And we mentioned children's play. Here is the new play area near the cafe. And I mentioned before, there are sort of further features around the park, from places where you can make your own sort of hideouts with brash to all sorts of stumps and lumps of wood that can become part of creative play. The football, rugby and cricket pitches have also been improved, and will shortly be launching the changing rooms, the new changing rooms, which will be changing rooms for all. Before the project, there was only changing rooms for men. There hadn't been a consideration for any female sports, so we hope to encourage all genders to the park, so everyone can get active at Marble Hill. And I think it's key with projects like this that they're about rejuvenating the cultural and natural heritage, and I think this has done that and reconnected the park with its community, and hopefully over the next decades we'll be making new heritage and new memories for future generations. The project was launched in May this year, and if we go on to the next slide, the grotto will be launched later this autumn. The rains we've recently had have now give us conditions we can complete the planting, because it was literally too dry to be able to plant without losing all our plants earlier in the summer. So once we've replanted and the turf is repaired, we're looking forward to letting our visitors in to enjoy the grotto. And if I could have my final slide, and we'd like to say thank you to the National Heritage Lottery Fund and all our donors who have made this possible. To Kate Slack, all of the staff and volunteers, as well as our consultants, our lead landscape consultants, J&L Gibbons, to our ground control, who are our landscape contractors, who've been fantastic to work with, to our Historic England archaeologists, who've uncovered so much and allowed us to know so much about the park, and the host of specialist consultants of ecologists, hydrologists, soil scientists, engineers, arboriculturalists, and more. We could not have done it without you. So thank you all very much, and thank you for listening. And I'll look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John and Emily. What a tour de force in terms of being able to share about the huge amount of work that has gone into this beautiful park that is known and loved by so many, but to bring that heritage back and to think about all the biodiversity and the importance of what this space means to us now and also for the future. It is a real delight that it is looking so beautiful, and I know that so many people are very excited about the launch of the grotto too, and indeed the upcoming months of extra work that has gone into this forethought and planning for the landscape. So on behalf of the community and all of those who would be here had we been doing this absolutely live, a huge thanks to you both. I've got a few questions for you just to delve into some of those, this kind of vast experience that you've had as we've revived Marble Hill, because there's been so many different nuances that have helped build this opportunity. And the first one I wanted to talk about was the archaeology, because there was a number of different parts that helped. You talked about the grotto, but helped forge that understanding of what really was beneath the ground. And I was just wondering whether you might be able to elaborate on the various different processes that went into that.
Yeah, shall I answer that one, John? Yeah.
Yeah, you start off.
So we had a very vast program of archaeology. It's probably one of the biggest programs of archaeology that English Heritage has done for quite a long time. It was over sort of 4 or 5 years. It took a long it was a process that we did a sort of a different separate dig every summer when we tried to find something else out. So we looked at things like the arbor, so the arcade, to make sure that we got that in the correct position so we could see it on the earthwork survey. And then we wanted to look again in archaeology to see if we could match the two up. We found things like the Nine Pin Alley surface, as John said in his talk, so we could use that evidence to then place that into the landscape. And then obviously the biggest bit of work which we did was at the grotto, where we sort of extensively had, I think we started archaeology there in 2017, and we did our last year. So it's sort of 4 years of work and doing various digs there to sort of continually sort of understand more and more. And it was in that last phase that we did last year that we really got to understand what we were dealing with and how it related to that historic plan. And I think the archaeology has been sort of critical to this project to sort of have that sort of basis of understanding of what survived and what was there and what we could then use to develop our plans. So I think, yeah, the archaeology has been absolutely critical to this sort of project.
And if I could quote one of the archaeologists who said, who actually to start with was quite skeptical about the grotto, but after the last dig, to quote him, he said that it's turned from a plan to a blueprint. At 1749, when we could actually see on the plan individual plants shown, and you find the planting holes for those in the archaeology. And what is amazing is that these things are still survived. And actually, one of the other things that we've had to sort of discover through other research is actually what has happened to different areas since they were lost, and we've discovered that the grotto had been totally forgotten about. And at about the turn, about 1900, there's a plan, and it shows a dip where the grotto is, and roughly where the grotto entrance is now, it shows a bench but no grotto. And it wasn't until the middle part of the 20th century that a tree fell down and exposed what they first thought was a pantry. Weird place to have a pantry, but so that was actually during the war, and so it was covered up, and it wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s that it was then re-excavated, and they discovered lots of shells in there and realized that it was a grotto. But again, money was spare, so they only, did a slot through, and that's probably why when they did the restoration in the 80s, they only did a sort of slot restoration, and didn't realize that the grotto was a really quite extensive development. And you think, well, that's a huge thing for Henrietta to have done. But when they constructed the house, the archaeologists found elsewhere they dug bits. They had dug pits for gravel and sand, and so one they just filled in, which is and still is a bit of a tip near a bit of a dip rather by some playing fields. But imagine you dig a big hole. You think, well, what do we make here? Well, why don't we put a grotto in this one, and another big hole? Well, we can put an ice house in there. So it starts to make sense. And if you think the cost today of transport of materials, if you can use materials that are local, it's a different way of sort of thinking of things. And so that starts to make sense. But we found that most likely that the rest of the grotto dip was filled in when they were looking to sort of build on the site, and it was filled with all sorts of awful rubbish that we had to remove as part of this project. And it's good for the park, but actually that's all gone now.
So it's sort of like being a bit of a detective, because it's everything sort of slowly on pieces, and you unpick where various things are found with the archaeology, but also been doing a lot of other research as well, not just in the ground, but on the peripheries as well, from letters. And you mentioned about it in the talk about the map of the plan as well. That sounds like an extensive amount of work to be able to understand our history and how it's been recreated. I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on that.
Yes, I think a lot of the work we did was sort of we built on previous research. So people knew that Marble Hill was an interesting and important landscape. It wasn't like that was revolutionary, but what we didn't really understand was the kind of level of which it was important, and its sort of historical value in a kind of set of very niche type and style of garden. And I think that research really sort of highlighted why we needed to do something at Marble Hill, and why it was important to kind of understand and preserve it as much as possible. But yeah, that research was sort of multifaceted. We had sort of I started researching it in 2014, and we didn't really start doing anything sort of in terms of our plans until a lot later. So there was quite an extensive period of sort of that background research where we literally I squirreled myself away in the archives, and we found, and other historians who were working on the project went away, and we just thought, how can we find everything that we can possibly find about this site so that we know that we're making decisions which are based on as much good evidence as possible? And that was a process that, takes a long time, but it eventually informs what we can and can't do on the site. So it's very critical work to be done. And it's nice to have a project where, we had that time to do that research properly and to really understand that landscape.
And I think it's worth saying more about the survey, 1749, circa 1749 survey, because we'd previously seen sort of copies of that in books, and not had dismissed it, but had thought it was just a sort of general plan, and hadn't realized the scale of it. And sort of we were reminded, well, I was reminded it was important from a sort of garden historian who suggested we needed to look at it in more detail. And Emily went to the archive and found the original plan, and found that, that the original plan is not some little thing. it's about a sort of yard square.
Mm.
And so there are, there is an immense amount of detail. There is a key there. So it's not us saying, oh, well, we think that's a grotto. It says key grotto. It says flower garden. It says ice house seat. All these things are written on there. And because we know that the garden had been laid out much earlier, this wasn't a proposal. This was a survey. And you found out a bit more about why that survey might have been carried out and who carried it out, didn't you?
Yeah, so it's an interesting point in Marble Hill's history, because at the time that the survey was being laid out, and we know that was about 1748, 1749, because of what's shown and what's not shown on the plans due to sort of land ownership and things. So that was a time where Henrietta Howard had finally sort of gained her independence, and her friend and trustee, the Duke of Argyll, was ready to sort of hand that landscape over to her. So he'd owned quite a lot of it in trust for her, so that her not very nice husband couldn't take it off her hands. And in 1749, 1748 is when he finally passes over that land. So the kind of theory is, and we know that it was drawn by the Duke of Argyll's surveyor, because it has a link between the plan that we have and with some of his other plans, and we know he was drawing on the back of things and reusing paper. So we know it's done by the same person as the Duke of Argyll surveyor. So the theory is, and it seems logical because it's happening at the same time, is that the surveyor for Duke of Argyll came down and sort of said, here it is, here's your land. And the Duke of Argyll presented it to Henrietta as that sort of, you've made it, well done, and here is the land that I'm handing over to you, and here is your garden as it now looks. So it's that lovely relationship between now to understand what that plan may have been used for and why it may have been produced, and therefore that gives us confidence in what we're using it for in this restoration today.
And then what's been useful is that we've then used the archaeology to then interrogate that plan. And one of the challenges has actually been finding paths, because finding gravel and sand paths in gravel and sand, naturally gravel and sand soil, isn't so easy. I've done this in gardens that have been on clay, and it's very, very clear there, because they cut the clay out and put gravel in. But it has been one of our challenges here, but we've found other features. Sometimes the planting holes either side, which indicates where the path would have been.
Well, it's fascinating, and I think kind of that really, really kind of detailed research and understanding has really made this project in terms of the landscape so unbelievably fascinating, as more things are uncovered to understand our history and our heritage in Twickenham. So thank you for that unbelievably careful work that you and the team have been doing, because it really helps us understand what is our heritage and how that landscape has transformed. It is fantastic to hear about all of that. But you talked about those amazing people who've made it possible, and I know you talked about those fantastic volunteers. Aren't they wonderful? But I know something that's very close to both of your hearts is around giving people opportunities, and I know that the apprenticeship scheme is something that's been very important as part of the Revive project, but also there's a wider scheme and way in which English Heritage invests in young people. Tell me more.
Yep, one of our sort of wider schemes that we've now trained over 300 horticulturalists who are in gardens all around the world is called a Historic and Botanic Garden Training Program. And we set this up a number of years ago because, together with a number of partners across the sector, we realized that the people who are working in gardens have become of a certain age, and there weren't enough young people coming up. And also what had been a sort of practice of employing students in sandwich courses had stopped, because college stopped doing sandwich courses and therefore stopped having middle year students. And also one of the problems is, if you've not been a student in the workplace, it's actually more difficult to be a supervisor of a student in a workplace. And so we developed a program where we have between sort of 16, 17, 20 students a year who we place in gardens across the UK, some English heritage, some others. And they have 12 months working in top gardens with top teams. And many of them come to us perhaps having carried out a qualification, but had no experience, or they have been volunteering in gardens and want to make that jump into becoming a professional gardener. And what we find is it gives them the confidence. They feel part of a sort of the professional gardener community. Those who've got qualifications already go on and may get higher qualifications or carry on and get more experience, or others go on and get more qualifications. And it's about 86% are still in the sector. And one of our head gardeners, Louisa Daudlien, was one of our very early trainees. And we recently had a conference for all our gardeners, and we realized that over 20% of our garden staff have been former trainees on the scheme. So, you know, it's great that it's worked and we've got those people out there, and because actually gardens are all about people. The gardens are there for people, and they're created and made by people, and it's people are needed to keep them going in the future.
I think it's absolutely incredible work, and it's great that sharing the expertise across English heritage is making those formative changes in people's lives. So thank you on behalf of them, but it's great that the charity is being able to support people and their next move to be our future gardeners. So huge congratulations on that amazing work. But just to bring you back to Marble Hill for a last little cheeky question. The landscape has completely transformed, but you must have your favourite parts of it. Could you tell us which are your favourite parts, and what has been the journey that has helped make you love them so much? Emily, should we start with you?
Yeah, I've got a bit of a cheat answer to this. I don't know if it's allowed. So I think one of my favourite things to do at Marble Hill is to walk all the way down from the house to the bottom next to the Thames, and then look back up across those avenues, and you can see those woodland quarters, and you can see the sort of grotto area coming together, and to kind of see that sort of 1749 plan sort of come to life in the landscape. And I think that's been the part that's been the most sort of rewarding for me, was to see how that research could become something tangible that people can walk around and enjoy today. And it just shows how heritage and history can be something transformative for people in public areas. So yeah, my answer is all of it, but I don't know if that's allowed as an answer.
I think it can be allowed, and I think, you know, kind of the way in which you describe about that walk really makes you know, kind of makes it feel very real, because it is a most beautiful vista that you have been very important in creating. So thank you, Emily. John, you can have a cheeky answer too.
Well, I'm going to be cheeky by suggesting two. The first is the avenue, which is part of what Emily described, and that's described in the literature as being a horse chestnut avenue. Unfortunately, on site we still have some remaining horse chestnuts that are on their sort of last legs, and there's various contemporary diseases that are seeing them go all around the country, unfortunately. And so we couldn't put back a normal horse chestnut, but we found that the Indian horse chestnut seems to be resistant to the sort of two diseases. There's a very fine specimen at Kew, just the other side of the river. And so we put in Indian horse chestnut there. So it's always the interesting thing about trees and planting trees is you're planting trees for people, for the next generation and the generation beyond that will enjoy them as you're imagining them. And so that's always sort of an exciting thing. And actually, planting a tree is a very important thing to do, and something that needs a huge amount of consideration. And I'm always a champion that we should be. Trees need space, and often there's a push to plant as many trees as possible, but we need to then thin trees so the ones we want to grow can grow to maturity, and that's why the maintenance of a landscape after a project or needs to carry on, and that's the one thing that is key. The other thing, the other part is the grotto, and I think it's because it's that journey through all of this project. We've been on a journey of discovery, and I think the longest discovery has been the grotto. And I think it's been one of the last piece of the jigsaw to slot into place. And what has been wonderful is Emily and myself have been looking and relooking at the plan and reinterpreting it and thinking of it as a three-dimensional image. And then we did the archaeology, and it's not until you get the diggers in and you actually discover it in there, and it has been wonderful to see that sort of something that's in the ground can't rise up, but it has in a way. And I think that will continue as the vegetation grows within there. And actually, revelation in going there after it's been planted, first phase of planting, was to see the impact of the trees. You're in this space which is surrounded by big trees, and the poem describes huge trees. It also describes huge rocks, and we've got huge rocks. And I look forward to future phases of work where we'll be able to restore the interiors with their shells, and sort of work more with the community to do more things there. So things carry on, and also things like meadows take time, and I think it's that as the landscape matures, that's one thing to really look forward to, and it only matures with the help of those who are looking after it and care for it.
Well, thank you. I think there are many parts that you've described, and I think what the one real take home is that this the Revive project has given this beautiful seed that actually is going to grow and be really exciting as the landscape matures. And thank you both for making that all very possible. And watch this space, because nature is wonderful, and it will only get better if we look after it, which is very well said, John. And of course, you can help us look after that, and you can do that by becoming a member. It's the easiest way to give back to English heritage. But do come and visit the house, do come and visit the landscape, and come and see those fantastic parts of the landscape that have been revived and have been revitalized. You can also join our volunteer team as part of the Gardens team, or you can even come and be part of the Friends of Marble Hill. These are all ways that you can support the life of Marble Hill going forward. But I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you so much, John and Emily, for taking us through this fantastical journey. We can't wait to find out where this journey of nature takes us. Thank you so much, both.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye. Good night.